Deliver at All Costs is a physics-based driving game where pretty much everything is destructible. Set in the 1950s in America, all is not as it seems.
The story of the game is about a guy called Winston Green. He has a temper and he is sort of down on his luck. He's about to get evicted from his apartment and he doesn't have a job. But one day when he wakes up, he hears like an ad on the radio. So he goes there to see if he can get employment there.
So the main protagonist is Winston Green. He's a former university student as an engineer who got kicked out of university. And he also has a very mysterious past that we're going to get to learn throughout the story.
The antagonist in the game is Donovan. He is a businessman, sort of cutthroat, and he is pretty cold in the way he approaches employees and people in general. He has something in his past that made him that way, but just like Winston, they sort of have similar things that has happened to them that sort of made them into who they are, which is explored in the story.
There are quite a few characters. One of them are Norman, who is Winston's best friend. And Norman has had a very tough life. He's one of the more joyous characters, I would say, in the game. We also have Bertha. She's a real shit. So she's the main antagonist of Act 2.
As a narrative designer, my greatest challenge is to fill in the gaps between the cool story and missions.
The scope of the story is told over 3 acts, and each act has a different location, so there are 3 major locations in the game. It's a really expansive story, and we have I think it's 2 hours of cinematics, and all lines are voiced, so it's a big story and a pretty big game for an indie developer, I think, especially the first game.
Deliver at All Costs is set in the late 50s, early 60s America, which to us is a very inspiring setting to work with all of the fashion and the style and atmosphere of the era. It's hard not to sympathize with all of that. It was also a very strange, happy or over-the-top cheerful tone when it comes to radio and television at the time, which we think is really hilarious to satirize with humor.
When you read about things people wrote back then and you see the advertisements from that time period, they're just funny in the way that a lot of things, the sort of demographics they are aiming towards and their ideas of how a family should look like and their sort of values are just really weird today. The inspiration for setting the game in the 50s and early 60s was just that growing up we all were inspired by just watching a lot of American cinema, and there was something really interesting about this time period, and also music. There's some really badass music from the 60s and 50s.
At the beginning, we researched a lot about the 1950s, and we made sure everything was totally accurate. But then slowly, when the story became more and more quirky and the mission became more and more quirky, we started to have more of an alternative history version of the 1950s. But yes, we have definitely done a lot of research, everything from buildings to clothes styles to what type of music existed in the 1950s. So there's actually a lot of story hints in the game, everything from a lot of visual clues, but there is also a lot of strange side characters. So one of those extremely quirky characters that we can encounter in the game is called Mr. Palmer. He lives on the roof of Flamingo Motel, where Winston lives, and he's afraid of giant worms, and that's why he's living on top of the roof. He's going to be someone we meet for a few times during the story. He's showing up in some of the cutscenes too, which you have to be quite observant to see him.
Deliver at All Costs is a narratively driven action game where everything is destructible, where you follow a character who is on the downward spiral towards insanity.